I was sitting in my small office near the end of the day when my landline phone rang. The caller ID read, Davis Jennifer. Miss Davis was the COO of Blackwell Industries, installed under her father's authority. Her father had died 3 months ago, and I had seen more of her just because she seemed to be busier, not having her father to lean on. I answered the call. Victor? Miss Davis' voice said. There was a hint of fear in it, not of me, but of something greater. It seemed strange that I would have anything to do with this. Yes, I said, a questioning in my voice. I'm Victor. You can probably tell from your caller ID that this is Jennifer Davis. I'd like to ask you to come up to the executive lounge. I'd like to have a discussion between two individuals. I know I'm the COO, and you're one of the accounting managers, but I have a favor to ask, a big one, and I need to frame the discussion as being of a personal nature, not a professional one. That was strange. What could she want from me that didn't involve work? I agreed to meet her in the executive lounge, if for no other reason than curiosity. How many times would I have the chance to go up for the view and the drinks? I took the elevator up to the top floor, and when I reached it, I was struck by how empty it was. Usually there's staff, aides, and secretaries running about, but since it was 7 p.m. on a Friday, there was no one. I marveled at how the opulent yet quiet it was. I found the door to the lounge, and it was empty as well. I saw a leather sofa with a few bottles of wine and liquor on a table, but just like the rest of the floor, the lounge was strangely deserted. I walked over to the windows that spanned the length of the room. For several minutes, I silently looked out at the riverfront, scanned the other high-rises of the downtown area, recognizing several of the tallest and most famous nearby. Before I continue my story, I want to tell you about the good folks who let me tell you my story. We are the music makers. Tell real human-written stories about life, love, and people trying to find each other. If you appreciate stories like this, we ask that you like the story and subscribe to the channel. Then more human-made stories will be told. Thank you. I looked out towards Brooklyn and was beginning to recognize aspects of my own neighborhood, a park, a roundabout, even a high-rise near my home, when I heard a voice behind me. You are a careful person, aren't you, Victor Greer? I invite you up to the executive lounge and you haven't sat down or had a drink yet. She paused. That is a trait I can appreciate. She pointed at the leather sofa, sat, and crossed her legs. Join me? I walked over and sat on the couch, keeping safe distance. She poured and mixed 2 old-fashioned eds and handed one to me. She held her glass up in a toast. I clinked mine against hers, but it was clear that neither of us took more than a small sip. Her face turned pink. Not much of a drinker, are you, Victor? Very moderate, Miss Davis. Plus, if we are going to have a discussion, maybe I should keep my head. Quite right, Victor, she said, almost as an admission to herself, rather than an agreement with me. She took a deep breath. I'm in need of something strange. Something unusual, she began. I took another small sip. I liked the feeling, but I wanted the effect to be small. I know this is going to be weird, and I need you to know that this is coming from Jennifer the woman, rather than the COO of the company. I nodded, slowly and slightly. Okay, well, since Dad died, the lawyers have revealed that I need to be married within 6 months of the funeral. I knew it was in well before Dad died, and I had been cultivating relationships with various executives, but none of them panned out. I was sort of involving myself, sort of trying to choose, but the job got in the way. Then Dad up and died of a heart attack out of nowhere, and now I have 3 months to be married, or my inheritance goes to the Audubon Society. She stopped, and I think she was letting the whole weight of the issue set in, waiting for me to slowly realize what she actually wanted from me. I took another small sip. On the horns of dilemma, I think. Probably 7 figures or more, but you have to be bound in matrimony. She nodded. And you've come to me with a plan, and you're hoping that I agree to it. She nodded. You've read the stories. You've seen the movies. You know the plot. I nodded, but then I sat and waited. It was for her to make the next move. As much as she wanted to make this about 2 people, I was sitting in her world. I was the office drone and she was the top executive. She sighed and nodded. Fine. You're a tough nut to crack. I need a husband. I need vows. I basically need for you to live with me for a year. Once all legal questions have been put to bed, I'll give you a lump sum cut of 10%. Make sure you have a hefty promotion, and we sign divorce papers. I thought for a long time. There's a crack in your logic. I don't expect you to think about this, but I'm a man who has to look at the real-world implications. You say 1 year, but that means we're engaged until the actual ceremony. Then there's a year, then a few months waiting for an uncontested no-fault divorce to go through, and only then could I pursue any relationships. Any dating I have right now has to be cut off. That means I probably have 2 years before I can really start again. That's a long time for a man. She thought about my words, and I could see her beginning to understand. Her concept of a 1-year marriage meant I was off the dating market immediately, and in order to not throw shade on her, I'd have to wait until the divorce was finalized before I could pursue women again, and that would be a cold start. It was a big ask. How do you suppose we resolve that? This time I could hear the wheels turning in her head. There was only one answer, and I could tell she didn't want to say it. Actual real intimacy, Miss Davis, once a week where we're actually doing the act. That resolves the issue of me having to wait 2 years before dating again. She stood up and started pacing. The fake marriage in her head was beginning to look terribly, frighteningly real. After a minute, she turned to me. That's insane. I nodded. It kind of is, but that's why fake marriages generally don't happen. Feelings get involved and needs go unmet. A man has physical impulses that naturally rise when he's in close quarters with a woman. She picked up her drink, walked over to the window, and sipped it as she looked out over the city while the shadows began to grow long in the late afternoon. The building was high enough that the eastward horizon was just beginning to change from blue to purple. A moment later, she turned back, walked over to me, and said, "What you're suggesting isn't a fake marriage, but a real one with a time limit." That was blunt enough that I took a sip of my own drink. I felt I had been unwavering, but when she laid out what I suggested like that, it was intimidating coming from the COO's lips. I wasn't supposed to see her as one of the company's top officers, but that was kind of impossible. I looked at my drink, realized I had finished half of it, set it down, and forced myself to look her in the eyes. I was surprised that they weren't outraged. They weren't the eyes of a woman who had shut down an idea in her mind. She was weighing it. She was considering it. That made the whole thing even more surreal. I thought I would suggest it. She would laugh at me, and then the whole thing would be over. The idea that she would let an office drone, even a manager, get physical with her, even under a marriage license, struck me as preposterous. But suddenly, she began nodding. The board can't really claim the whole thing is a sham if we post pictures from a honeymoon suite in Hilton Head. She stared at me for a minute, then picked up her phone, clearly sending a message to someone. HR probably won't like that I'm marrying an employee, but I have a cohort at Gemini Systems who owes me a favor, and I bet she would love to steal away a manager to be her new director of accounting. She paused and looked at me. Don't consider this a favor. Consider it a marital connection. I raised an eyebrow, but she continued. Marrying a low-level manager might be almost as much of a scandal as fighting my father's will. She sat down on the couch next to me. But a man who became the director of accounting and who left my employ suddenly becomes almost acceptable. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it and gave a possessive smile. You have an interview at 10 a.m. I think that you know how to comport yourself with dignity. Then she surprised me by sitting down next to me and planting her hand on my chest. Don't you think you should give your new, very real fiancé a thank you kiss? I leaned in, expecting to offer a light, sweet kiss, maybe even a peck, something out of appreciation. But before I knew what was happening, her lips were pressed to mine, her hands were around my neck, and she was leaning into me. After a minute, she pulled back and looked me in the eyes. That wasn't such a bad idea, Victor. I knew I had a good reason for picking you. Then she sat up. We didn't kiss again for the rest of the night. We talked about our lives, our past relationships, and what we should do during the year of our marriage. I was thinking a Florida trip, maybe a tour of New York City. She was visibly amused at that. She had wanted to go to Portugal, Australia, maybe even Egypt. We also talked about losing our parents. When the night was over, I was kind of looking forward to this marriage. The next day, instead of heading into work, I put on my good suit and went to Gemini Systems. Sarah Colley was the vice president of the company, and she was looking over my resume. You know, Mr. Greer, the opening for the director of accounting just came up. Not even everyone in the company knew about it, but I'm spa friends with Jennifer, so of course I told her about it just 2 days ago. I nodded. Usually we prefer someone with 5 or more years of accounting management experience, but she looked up at me curiously. Friend's recommendation carries a lot of professional weight. We don't doubt you can carry out the duties, but this is a larger responsibility. You're responsible for the entire company's filings and records. That's no small task. I nodded. I've been preparing for this opportunity my whole life. I have familiarized myself with all the major accounting software programs. I know almost the entire corporate tax code line by line, and I don't do anything halfway. Miss Colley looked at me again. If you come at Jennifer Davis's recommendation, I believe you. We're taking you on. She handed me a folder with all the necessary documents. I looked at the compensation form, and my eyes nearly fell out of my head. Income was triple my old salary, along with several different allowances and my own corporate credit card. There was even an allowance for a home office, as I could work remotely 2 days per week. I almost broke out in tears. "Oh, I got a text from Jennifer this morning," Miss Colley said. "She told me to make sure you stopped by the jewelry store. She said you would know what that means." I stared at her for a moment. My jaw nearly hit the floor. Miss Davis had already called me her fiancé, and now she wanted me to go to a jewelry store. Okay. Well, Miss Colley. Yes, I think I do know what that means. She stood up, then I did as well. Good. And please call me Sarah. We can be familiar and professional at the same time. I think you'll be a fine addition to the team. She held her hand out. I shook it, and that was how I started at Gemini Systems. On the strong recommendation of Sarah, I found myself going to Van Cleef and Arpels in Lenox Hill. The prices for jewelry were eye-watering, but for the first time in my life I realized I could afford them. It would almost empty out my savings at the moment, but the new income would make up for that in a few months. When I walked out, I couldn't believe I had spent over $20,000 on an engagement ring. But I wanted something that Miss Davis would be proud to wear. That afternoon, I was at my desk when the phone rang again. Jennifer Davis popped up on the caller ID again. When I answered it, she offered no pleasantries. "I'm told you got the position." I confirmed that was true, and I believe my dear friend Sarah suggested that you stop at a jewelry store. She did, I admitted, and I took her advice. You did." There was a long pause. "Which one?" I hesitated, worried it wasn't up to her standard. "Van Cleef." There was an even longer pause. "Van Cleef, right off of Madison Avenue." I didn't know what to say to that. There were pricier stores, I knew, but they were out of my range, even with the new job. "Can you come up to the lounge at 6?" she asked. "I'll have something to eat ready. Say, a nice filet with a sauce. If you're serious about Van Cleef, I think you deserve a little fine dining." Then she hung up. I went up to the executive suite right at 6 p.m. This time it was well-staffed. There was even a concierge who was clearly also standing guard. I mentioned that I was a guest of Jennifer Davis, and she looked at me, then down at her clipboard. "Victor Greer?" I nodded. "Very well, she's expecting you." When I entered, Miss Davis was sitting at the bar nursing a glass of wine. She saw me, smiled knowingly, and told me to order a drink. "Sam Adams," I said. She nodded, apparently approvingly. When I got my beer, she gestured for me to follow her. She led me to a smaller room, still overlooking the city. "This is usually the cigar bar." She glanced at me. "You don't smoke cigars, do you?" "Only at weddings," I responded. She nodded. "Tolerable, but not in my home." She nodded firmly. "Now, did you bring it?" I nodded and pulled out the flawless moss green jewelry box from my jacket pocket. She drew in a breath at the box alone. I set it on the table. "You weren't kidding." She stared at it. "You could have gone to Tiffany." She continued to stare, then looked at me. She clearly wanted me to say something. "Everyone knows Tiffany. Everyone gets Tiffany." Tiffany is a pop culture reference at this point. If you'll be inheriting big numbers once we're married, then you deserve something with a little more class to it. She stared at me, then looked down at the box again. I had thought she would have snatched it from my hand, but she stared at it like she was afraid to touch it. Finally, I gently opened the box. When she saw it, she put her hand to her mouth. It was a half-carat, nearly flawless diamond, set in platinum. "This is for me?" I nodded. She slowly reached for it, almost as if it were going to disappear and be replaced with a Zales box. Then she slowly pulled the ring out and put it on her finger. There were tears in her eyes. If I had built a relationship with a husband that wasn't just to salvage my inheritance, I wouldn't have expected him to go to Van Cleef. She reached for my face. "You have truly surprised me." She stared at the ring on her finger. "That doesn't happen very often." We both looked at the ring on her finger. "Every time I think I have you figured out, you surprise me, Victor Greer. I wasn't entirely expecting you to buy a ring. You outdid yourself." I nodded slightly. "Miss Davis, call me Jennifer." She looked around. "In private for now. But once you've started with Gemini and the engagement is announced, then in public as well." I drew in a breath. "Jennifer, you've given me a gift, a fine job, something that will carry me into a comfortable life, no matter what the future holds." It was just then that a waiter came in. "Fillets for two, mashed new potatoes, white asparagus, and sourdough bread." He brought in 2 plates and carefully placed the steaks on them, leaving the sides for us to serve ourselves. When he was gone, Jennifer smiled at me. I ordered medium rare for the both of us. I hope that is sufficient. She paused, and I hope you don't eat your steak well done. She whispered with a twinkle in her eye. I shook my head. If I wanted shoe leather, I'd go to Nordstrom. That got a laugh from her, and not a small chuckle. A real laugh where she threw her head back and let her voice bounce off the wall. She served herself some of the sides, pushed them over to me, and said, I think I'm going to enjoy this marriage. She dropped her fork and covered her mouth. Then she looked at me, and I wondered if she would take it back. When she said nothing for almost a minute, I cut a piece of my steak, took a bite, and almost fell into a trance. That was a steak. I looked down at the rest of it. Peter Luger? I asked. She shook her head, barely moving her hand from her mouth. Smith and Wolinski. I nodded. I knew I was going to enjoy it when you called Gemini last night. She smiled at that, and for the rest of our meal, we couldn't keep our eyes off of each other. When the meal was over, she took my hand and we looked out over the Hudson River and across to New Jersey. After a minute, she took my hand. I was surprised and looked over at her, and her lips were slightly parted. I leaned over and pressed my lips to hers. Thank you for the meal, I said when our lips parted. She stared back at me, and for a moment she was silent. Then she squeezed my hand. Thank you for making all this feel real. We agreed to see each other for evening meetings twice each week. Once the engagement was announced, I would have to attend functions with her. I agreed. I think she was trying to communicate that these evening meetings were to be perfunctory, but once we started seeing each other, they never seemed to feel like business. Of course, she took me to French places, seafood restaurants, and high-end Italian, but I insisted we do normal things once each week. One Tuesday, it was a carriage ride through Central Park. Another, it was a movie in Shake Shack. Each time we did something inexpensive, she'd give me this look like I was crazy, but when we got off the carriage at Columbus Circle, she was already pleased. Then when we walked to the Carnegie Diner, we both ordered the espresso and cheesecake. When she bit into her strawberry cheesecake, she literally leaned over and rested her head on my arm. Victor, that is amazing. I didn't know cheesecake could be that good. She looked up at me from my shoulder. I'm taking you to the best places, yet your inexpensive things feel like they're worth so much more. She sat up again, took another bite, and put her hand to her mouth. That's divine. I had taken a bite, and when she looked over at me, she reached over and wiped a spot of chocolate from my cheek. When she realized what she was doing, she froze, her hand still inches from my face. She stammered, and then we both went silent. Victor, I think you need to kiss me. I leaned over and pressed my lips to hers again. She leaned into me. Since we were in public, it was brief, but she still said, Victor, you make kissing too easy. I looked into her eyes as she smiled at me a little too easily. I was thinking the same thing about you, Jennifer. She smiled, then picked up a napkin and wiped her fingers. I swear, Victor, here I am wiping your face like you're 12. The moment it left her mouth, she shot me an uncertain look, as if she'd gone a little too far. But I just laughed out loud. A moment later, she started laughing too. I wondered if I would someday have a real relationship as much as I liked this one. The engagement was technically announced twice. The first was at a small party with Jennifer's closest business friends. It was held at her apartment in the Garment District. All of her friends seemed to comment at how surprised they were that such a normal guy like me could land a woman like Jennifer, but by the end of the dinner, one of them, Leslie, said she'd never seen a woman look at her fiancé the way Jennifer did. The second announcement was a line in the New York Post, noting that the youngest COO was engaged with a newly hired director of accounting of another corporation. She showed it to me, then took the paper from my hands and threw it away. If it had been the New Yorker, that would have been the sign I had made it in the top circles. She took my arm. But at least I have you. I glanced at her, and she started at my gaze. But she didn't pull her arm away. I think at this point we had finally gotten to the point where we didn't want to admit either that we felt something or that this was a temporary arrangement. We agreed to plan the wedding to be small, maybe 50 guests. We had looked at the open areas near her apartment, and she fell in love with Pier 76, right along the Hudson River. We found an officiant, and Jennifer said she was always enamored with the vows from the Book of Common Prayer, which were what her grandparents had used. We planned the reception from her apartment. It was to be held at the executive lounge of her company, a 4-piece chamber group, a specific brand of sparkling wine from California, plates of roast beef, but also a large stack of Shake Shack cheeseburgers, cheesecake from the Carnegie Deli, and wedding cake from a bakery I had never heard of. Double-decker cake, white on the inside and a raspberry filling. I shook my head. I hate raspberries and white cake tastes like sweetened batter. Give me a custard filling and yellow buttery cake on the inside. I saw her eyes narrow in my direction. She opened her mouth and I winced. Maybe she noticed the wince, or maybe something in her mind snapped into place because she tousled my hair, smiled, and said, "Fine. Yellow and custard, but I get the decorations I want." I nodded in acceptance. She let out a breath of relief and smiled a little. We got through a bunch of smaller details, and then she closed her notebook. Then she looked up at me. "Let's go sit on my sofa. There's something else I want to talk about." She gave me a small smile and then stood up. I did the same and followed her to her sofa. She sat down and I did the same, leaving a few inches of space. When we were initially settled, she looked down at the space, then at me. She didn't say anything, she just stared at me. I moved closer, so we were at least brushing each other's shoulders. She nodded pertly, seeming pleased. But then she hesitated. "Victor, I know we've talked about travel and all the places we both want to go, but I'm thinking that maybe we keep things small. I have a friend with a nice place along the coast in Southampton. If we're going to be intimate, maybe we could do it in a more familiar setting. I'm sure we can still travel together in the summer or near Christmas. I just want to make this as comfortable as possible." I reached out and took her hand. "Jennifer, I've seen the ocean plenty of times, but it's always been from a hotel room or just on the beach itself. I've never had the pleasure of being in a house and watching the ocean." I could feel her eyes on me. "You don't owe me a honeymoon of any kind. That was never part of the agreement. So riding to Southampton and enjoying the ocean, the town, maybe an activity or two will be like a dream to me." I could see her eyes moving from my eyes to our enclosed hands. Perhaps she felt this was too much. "You're holding my hand, Victor. Do you want me to let go, Jennifer?" I asked. She shook her head. We just sat there for a minute, saying nothing. Then when she looked at me again, the apartment felt a lot smaller. "Kiss me again, Victor," she whispered. The kiss started heavy and deepened almost immediately. Our lips crashed over and over. Tongues found each other and couldn't be separated. Hands explored each other's bodies. We might have lost our composure completely had her phone not rung. It was Beethoven's Fifth, with the foreboding strings filling the room. She pulled back and sighed. "That's Williamson, the CEO. I have to take that." She walked over to the kitchen where she had left it, picked up the phone, and answered. Whatever the call was about, it wasn't good. "Shareholders upset," she repeated. "So what if they have questions about the merger? First thing in the morning, fine." She ended the call. She walked back onto the couch, slumped into it, leaning into me. "Williamson is calling for an early morning board meeting over shareholder concerns about the merger with Hanson Logistics." That led me to several questions, though none felt like I should ask them. She took my hand again. "You are making this engagement too natural, Victor. I thought this was going to be cold and quiet signings, minimal contact, barely see each other. But everything you're doing makes me want to see you again and again." She reached up and drew her hand across my cheek. "I hate asking you to go, but this meeting complicates my life." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with sadness and a little hope. I nodded and ran my hand through her hair. "Okay, Jennifer, if what you need is sleep and prep, then I'll let you go for the evening." We slowly untangled ourselves from each other. I stood up and she did as well. I gathered my things and started for the door. But before I could reach it, she took hold of my arm. There was that look in her eyes again, so I took her in my arms and kissed her again. This was not as desperate, though I think both of us were holding back. When we parted, she stared at me like she was wrestling with something within her. She still had her hands over my shoulders. "Good night, Victor," I low. Her eyes widened and I could see the fear in them as the near-spoken words set in. I gave her a peck and just said, "I low too." Then I walked out her door and went home. With the engagement public and the wedding plans firm, I began to take on the supporting role that a corporate executive needs. There were a couple cocktail parties I attended. The first was kind of uncomfortable. "You're the director of accounting at Gemini?" Williamson looked at me and glanced at Jennifer. The silence hung as if he intended something he knew he couldn't say in polite company. Well, Jennifer must see something in you." Jennifer had stepped in to defend me, which was both comforting and effective at ending any skeptical glances at further events. One day, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Hello, Mr. Greer. This is Allison, PA for Alan Williamson at Blackwell. Mr. Williamson likes to golf on Saturday mornings, but one of his regular foursome has been forced to cancel. He asked me to extend an invitation for you to fill in his place. It would be a good way to get to know the fiancé that Miss Davis talks about at every meeting. It was for a 7 a.m. tea time at Bally's in the Bronx." I accepted, though I felt I should run it by Jennifer. If she didn't want me to get too close to her colleagues, that only seemed fair. We were scheduled to dine at the Del Frisco's Grill near Rockefeller Center. When I arrived, I could see her at the bar. She picked up her drink, took my arm, and the waiter brought us to our table. The conversation was casual, though the buzz I had felt never went away. Her hand always seemed to brush my arm. When our feet touched under the table, it didn't seem to bother her. When there seemed to be a moment, I said, "I got a call from your executive offices today. Williamson wants me to join him for golf at Bally's this Saturday." I accepted, but I wanted to bounce it off of you before I actually go. Jennifer sipped her wine. "Sounds like Williamson," she remarked dryly. "Get into the mind of the man whom he assumes will be influencing me." She paused. "He probably knows that you work for Gemini, and he might be fishing for data. But if accounting has important details, the situation is already too big for him to not know." She looked up at me. "Are you asking permission?" I leaned back. "Not exactly, but I did want to give you the chance to air out concerns. If you think that golfing with your people is a little too close for your comfort, I can understand that. I would rather you feel like I'm making your life easier rather than taking advantage of my access." She looked at me for a minute, though it felt longer, and then she smiled slightly, took another sip, and only said, "I have no objections. If Williamson wants to interrogate you, then maybe that's a good thing. But they're not out there to belittle you. They want to see what you're made of. Smile at their jabs. Don't let anything get under your skin, and they won't forget that you have me behind you. If things went too disrespectful, they'd have me to deal with." She took hold of my hand, and that felt final. That Saturday, I did go out to Bally's. The scenery was amazing, the course was trimmed to perfection, and the banter between the other three was infectious. I kept my head down mostly, trying to represent Jennifer responsibly. I let the banter slide past me, but at one point when a vice president put a ball into the water, I said, "I'm just a director of accounting." But that shot would require a full audit. The other three stared at me for a minute. But then Williamson let out a raucous laugh, probably aided by the ewe angling in his hand, and then the other two joined in. Williamson clapped my shoulder. "That's a good one, Greer. You don't say much, but if you can get a zinger like that off, you'll do all right." While I was sitting at the clubhouse bar, I got a text from Jennifer. "I don't like sharing you like I have been. Can I see you at your place tonight?" I texted back a confirmation. Then I stood up and asked for my tab. Williamson told me he'd cover it, and after a second attempt to pay my own way, I pulled out a 20, left it on the bar, and headed home to my brownstone in Brooklyn. That evening, Jennifer visited my place for the first time. Technically, it was slightly larger than her apartment, but since it was a 3-story brownstone in a tight neighborhood, it felt smaller. I left the front door open, and when she arrived, it was with a knock as she entered. I had 2 cups of green tea, and for a while we drank them at my small island. We talked about the golf outing. I guessed that I had carried myself sufficiently. She told me she was sure it was fine. Williamson would have communicated with her if there was a problem. Then she reached out for my hand. "Did you enjoy it?" she asked. "It was fine," I answered softly. "I golf when I need to, but it's not my favorite pastime. If it can represent you well, I'll go. And a few drinks at the end doesn't hurt, either. They're all going to be at the wedding, you know," she pointed out. I nodded. "I'm glad you're getting along." But then she squeezed my hand. "But for some reason, I spent the entire morning wondering if you were enjoying yourself without me." I hated myself for it, but I couldn't get it out of my mind. I thought about her words carefully. "I had a good time, I'm not going to lie, but the pleasure of the outing wasn't enhanced by your absence. It was its own thing. If there had been a way to bring you along, that would have been its own pleasure." I paused. "But maybe it's better that I made it through 18 holes and behaved myself without you. Seeing me participate like I belonged without you, there probably did both of us a lot of good." She nodded, but for a few minutes didn't say anything. She sipped her tea and then looked around. "Can you give me the tour?" I then took her around, showing her the living room and the postage stamp backyard. The second floor had the master bedroom and a bathroom across the hall, and then third floor had 2 more bedrooms. I had one furnished as an office, but I didn't use it much. The other had a few random furniture pieces, some boxes, and my winter clothing hanging up in the closet. She walked in and sat at my desk. "This house is very you. Quiet, understated, functional." She allowed a smile to cross her lips, "But I think it needs a woman's touch." She glanced at the other room. "How would you feel if I put in an office of my own across the hall?" I stared at her, trying to understand. Now don't overthink this, Victor. We're going to be at each other's places a lot in the future. I could use a place to open up my laptop, and you can use it as a larger tax write-off. She looked around the room again. I can see the appeal of this place. Old, charming, almost colonial. She let out a yawn. How do you feel about ordering something tonight, Victor? Maybe a nice Thai restaurant that delivers. I put in an order to a nearby Thai place. When the delivery came about a half hour later, we sat on the couch with about 10 different boxes. I had a pad Thai, while Jennifer focused on a vegetable dish. Are you ready for the wedding next week? She asked, not quite sounding casual. I took a bite and shrugged. Probably not. The Armani suit is going to be ready in the morning. But how does a man really get ready for a wedding, especially one as unusual as ours? She nodded as she ate. Have you enjoyed our engagement? She paused. I know you've spent a lot of money, but I feel like we both have really tried to make it something we can look back on happily. I found myself nodding. There have been times where I've wished. I hesitated. Probably what was going to come out of my mouth was too much. Well, they've probably been the happiest weeks of my life. When I looked over at her, she was holding a bite between the box and her mouth, and her face was red. She put her box of food down, wiped her mouth, and said, I'm done. I don't mind if you keep eating, but I'm done. So come over here and let's watch a movie. I moved over and sat with her on the couch. Almost immediately, I felt her hand in my hair. I put an arm over her shoulder and started a movie, some James Bond thing, I think. But before the movie was half over, I heard her breathing shallow. Her hands had fallen to her lap. I stopped the movie, found a blanket, tossed it over her, and then leaned over her. I know you can't hear me, and maybe that's why I have the courage to say it, but I've realized that I love you, and I don't want this to end. Not now, not in a year. Never. She shifted a little, went, and then leaned her head back into the cushion. I turned out the lights, went into my room, and fell asleep, wishing I wasn't alone. When I woke up early the next morning, the sun was rising up over Long Island, but before I opened my eyes, I could feel something out of place. The shape of the bed under me was off. I rubbed my eyes, looked around, saw Jennifer lying next to me. I must have started a little in surprise because she slowly opened her eyes, saw me, and smiled. Good morning, fiancé, how are you? Then she wrapped her arms around me. I joined in, putting my arms around her too. What made you follow me in here, Jennifer? She looked at me thoughtfully. I had gotten up to go to the bathroom, and I saw you sleeping in the bedroom through the open door. You looked so comfortable there in your bed, and my back was stiff, so I climbed in next to you, and it felt so much better. I didn't want to be away from you if we were in the same house. We held each other for another hour. At one point, she accidentally pressed too close to me. She froze for a heartbeat, glanced up at me with an embarrassed smile, and eased back a few inches. Neither of us said anything, but at 9 a.m., she got up, gathered the clothes that she had brought with her. I have some friends to meet in the afternoon, and an appointment for the wedding. She went into the bathroom, dressed as well as she could, combed her hair out with my comb, and washed her face. When she came out, she came over, sat on the bed, put her hand on my chest, and asked, Are you glad I came over, Victor? I'm always glad when you're around, I said softly. She smiled, drew small circles on my chest with her finger, and said softly, Careful, Victor. You might get me to believe you if you keep saying things like that. Then she leaned over, kissed me from above, and whispered, Next time you might not get off so easily. She stood up. Call me tonight? I nodded, and I watched as she scurried first out from my bedroom door, and then out of my house into her car. When the wedding finally came around, I found myself carrying a strange burden. I knew within myself that I was pleased to be marrying her, and I was reasonably certain that she felt the same way. But the idea of the year felt like a pall hanging over me. I decided, as I drove to Pier 76, that I would have to discuss it with her soon after her inheritance was settled. When I arrived, some friends met me, and we made our final preparations. One had a flask and handed it to me. I didn't want to go into my wedding even a little foggy, but I allowed myself one swallow. It burned going down, and it felt like a little burst of energy, a tiny bump in my courage. The entire wedding was designed to be short. The chamber group would play 2 pieces, then everyone would sit down. When the cellist drew a low C, I would come out. Then upon a brief flourish of the group, Jennifer would come out from a nearby bathroom, Mendelssohn's Wedding March would begin, and then the whole thing would be over in 5 minutes. She had given me a copy of the Book of Common Prayer's vows. She had found a Lutheran minister who nevertheless agreed to use the traditional vows, updated a little. I found myself feeling a little sad and a bit dishonest when I repeated, I, Victor Greer, take you, Jennifer Davis, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part, according to God's holy ordinance, and to you alone I make this promise." She made her vows, very similar, still in the traditional meaning. We exchanged rings. This time, Tiffany bands that she had chosen and paid for, and with the coda of the wedding march, that was the entire ceremony. We spent maybe an hour taking pictures, at the park, along the pier, and then at various places at the Blackwell offices. But then we went to the reception, held at the same executive suite at the top of Blackwell, where she and I had spoken for the first time. Of course, there was the double-decker wedding cake, with yellow pound cake and custard on the inside. She even had a fine groom's cake made, designed to look like a golf course. Somehow she found out about the audit line I had made, and so the words are, "I am only the director of accounting, but that shot would require an audit." Williamson laughed out loud when he saw it. When we cut the cake together, the yellow cake and custard appeared from the edge. When we took our first bites, Jennifer leaned over and whispered, "You were right, I thought you were crazy, but this is perfect." Prime rib was the main meat, but there was also a tray of Shake Shack hamburgers and Carnegie Deli cheesecake, in honor of having something delicious without breaking the bank. When the reception was officially over, we went to the receiving line thanking those who attended. One of Jennifer's cousins said, "Burgers were the best part. Perfect addition." An older woman whispered, "Is that cheesecake really from Carnegie Deli?" I nodded. "Well, I guess I'll have to go, won't I?" Countless people complimented her dress, a simple white that covered one shoulder with taffeta from the neckline to the waist. To me, she looked perfect. At the end, Leslie, one of her best friends and the maid of honor, approached us. Whose decision was it to have the burgers and cheesecake in the back? Neither of us said anything, but I could feel Jennifer's eyes on me with a knowing smile. Leslie kissed my cheek and smiled. He has good ideas. I'd keep listening. My face burned, but after Jennifer and Leslie hugged, that was kind of the end. Williamson approached us. He looked at me. When Davis here informed me that she was engaged to a mere director of accounting, and at Gemini of all places, I thought she had lost her mind. But I think I see it now. He paused, looking at her. She's been needing a man she could trust and get comfortable with. Not a guy, not a warm body. A man. And that's what you are. He looked over at Jennifer. Too bad that you're already on the board. He'd make an interesting choice for a vice president in a couple years. She smiled at me. Williamson kissed her kindly and whispered, "Congratulations, Greer. I've called for the staff to come and clean this up, so you kids go off and do whatever it is you're going to do on your wedding night." Jennifer smiled at Williamson, took my arm, and a minute later, we were headed down the elevator, headed back to her apartment, where a bunch of our stuff was already stowed. When we closed the door to her apartment, something felt different. A little heavier, warmer. When she looked at me, there was a feeling that she was pleased. We collapsed on the couch, tired from a long day. "Well," she said, "we're married." "Yes," I agreed. "Yes, we are. I still don't really believe it." She looked up at me. She already knew my tone. She knew it wasn't perfect. It wasn't as clean as it should have been. "You don't regret it, do you, Victor?" "Of course not," I said quickly. And I didn't. "I've been looking forward to marrying you since you put my engagement ring on your finger." I touched my finger to the ring. "Victor," Jennifer said, her voice soft. "I want to make this the best year of our lives. I want to make every day feel like we can't tear away from each other." I took her hand and kissed the knuckles near her engagement and wedding bands. "You are already succeeding, Jennifer. These past weeks have been the best of my life." I smiled, but I knew that I couldn't quite keep the hint of sadness from my eyes. I had something else on my mind. "Jennifer, I feel like I should say this. We never really agreed to contact after special events. You don't have to put yourself out for me. We can just agree on a day of the week, and I'll abide by that." She stared at me, and I think she knew what both my mouth and my eyes were saying, but she said nothing to either of them. A moment later, she hopped up onto my lap, pulled my lapel up towards her, and crashed her lips into mine. I don't want to go into too many details, but eventually we were side by side in her bed, quietly holding each other, sipping the last bottle of sparkling wine that she had pulled from the wedding. Then she whispered, "The once-a-week bargain is not going to be strictly enforced. If you're going to be that good most weeks, it's going to be at least twice, because I'll want you to hold me even more often. You feel too good to ignore 6 days each week." We didn't get much sleep that night. Between talking, realizing that we still had enough energy, we went 3 more times before the sun began to peek out over the East River. Every time felt perfectly natural. Every time felt like we fit together perfectly. Finally, around 5 in the morning, We both fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. For the next 3 months, that was the feeling between ourselves. We had initially agreed to spend 2 nights per week in her apartment, and then 2 more at my brownstone. For 2 weeks we tried, but both times when she kissed me goodbye, and I knew I wouldn't see my wife for 3 days, that felt too hard. When we found ourselves back at her apartment, she brought it up. I don't know how you feel, but I think the 3 days apart are too much.
I've gotten too used to waking up next to you, to reaching out for you. I want you there. I let out a sigh of relief. I was afraid I was the only one, I admitted. Do you think we should make it 3 days at each other's places? She nodded. Yes, that's exactly what I'm thinking. She looked up at me as we sat on her sofa. You like having me around, don't you, Victor? I felt tears beginning to fill my eyes. I felt like I was failing her because she even asked the question. Nothing in my life hurt so much as that question. I blinked the tears back. More than anything, Jennifer, I was going to bring this up, perhaps a little more delicately, but yes, 2 more nights with you is exactly what I want too. And for 5 months that became our status quo. Sometimes she'd have to go on a business trip, usually not more than once per month. Sometimes I'd have to work late nights to deal with all the accounting issues. In March I began feeling like I was living at the office, and to my utter surprise, but also delight, she'd appear with Chinese food and Cokes, and we'd spend an hour in the break room, and even if I'd be home after midnight, she made it feel like we were still connecting. But almost 6 months to the date of our wedding, we were sitting quietly in her apartment when she handed me a piece of paper. It was from the executor of the will. He had certified the marriage, had confirmed cohabitation, and cleared the inheritance. She pointed at a number near the bottom, $12.7 million. Part of that was in Blackwell stock that made her one of the single largest shareholders in the company. I looked up at her. That's wonderful for you, I whispered. For me? She asked, hearing the rueful edge to my voice. I nodded. Sure, this was what you sought the marriage out for. You needed a husband to confirm the funds. Your future is set. She didn't say anything. She didn't protest. She didn't tell me what was right or wrong. But she leaned over, and when she pressed her lips to mine, it was different. It wasn't the crash of desire that needed to be met immediately, but it was purposeful, as if she was trying to hold things together with just the affection that was always there. I don't want to make you think I'm sending you away, Victor. Don't ever think that. You're mine, and that doesn't change just because we don't have to keep up appearances for my inheritance. You're not going anywhere. For the short term, that was enough. From there, I could live with the small weight in my stomach. It would have been so easy for her to say, I have what I want. Here's the check I promised you when this was over. I'm filing for divorce. But she allowed it to get pushed back. The pit was manageable, but I found that it was growing larger a tiny bit every day as the end drew near. But then something enormous happened. Over the course of almost a year, I had done my job as director of accounting. I was reliable. I made sure all the numbers matched. I had even gotten a commendation from the board for my work. Sarah told me that never happened for people who had been with the company less than a year. I was proud of my work. But she called me into her office. There's an opening for Director of Compliance in DC opening up in about a month. The company has decided to offer you the role without even putting the position on the company website. I frowned, but I tried to keep a composed, even pleased voice. Oh wow, that's amazing. How long would I need to decide? 3 days, Sarah responded. If you haven't agreed to fill the position after 3 days, it goes up on the company website, and then you'd have to interview for it. I nodded. All right, Sarah. I'm sure I can have an answer for you by that time. I'll need to talk it over with my wife, but I'm sure we can figure out what to do from there. Sarah smiled, and I smiled back, but I hated it. That night was the one night of the week we weren't together, and I hated it. I didn't eat anything that night, nor the next morning, either before or during work. But by the time I left work the next day, I hadn't eaten anything for almost 30 hours. The offer was eating me up. I didn't want the promotion. I didn't want to go to Washington, D.C. All I wanted was Jennifer. I shook my head as I drove over to her place that evening. When I came in, her smile seemed to fail. I'm sure I was pale, but I hadn't slept either, so I imagine I was ragged looking. She took my hand, led me to the couch, and rested my head on her shoulder. Victor, Vic, tell me what's wrong. How long has it been since you've eaten anything? Yesterday at lunch, I said slowly. She gasped. Victor, this isn't like you. What's wrong that you just stopped eating? I shook my head as it rested on her. I was almost unable to say it. I've been offered a position as Director of Compliance, and that's in DC. She sat with her hand in my hair. Victor, that sounds like a wonderful opportunity for you. I don't understand how that has caused you to look like you're dying on the inside. I looked up at her.
My voice was rough from even a lack of water. I don't want to take it for the same reason that I've been dreading what's supposed to happen in 3 months anyway. I'm telling you because if you think that we should go our separate ways, then I can take the job in Washington and try to forget the happiest year of my life. But I'm not going to pretend that my life is going to lose the most important and best part of my life if the divorce is what we decide. I sighed. This job in Washington is just what will make it bearable. I didn't know how she'd respond to that. I thought maybe she would say to go immediately. If Washington would make the pain of the divorce dull, then go. Maybe she'd be happy to get her life back.
Maybe she'd tell me that this was all a ruse to keep me happy, and that if there was another option for me, she'd gladly drop the act and send me off. What I didn't expect was a moment of silence followed by actual tears. Oh my Victor, you've still been telling yourself that this was all still on a timer. I thought I had made it clear. I thought every day I spent with you, every night I came home to you, every time I reached for your hand. I thought that was me telling you. She leaned over and kissed my lips, dry as they were. I looked up at her surprised. That's exactly what I had thought. She took my hand and raised it to her cheek. Victor, let me be as clear as I can. I don't want you to leave me. Ever. Not tomorrow. Not for a job in Washington. Not on our first-year anniversary. You were still trying to keep the deal with the COO of Blackwell. She brushed away a tear from her face and choked up a little. When she continued, her voice was strained. The COO isn't here at your side, Victor. She hasn't been since before the marriage. You've got Jennifer holding you, and Jennifer is asking you to stay with her. Not to hold up a bargain, not to ensure an inheritance. Those are done. I want you to stay because I love you, and I don't want to live in a world where you're not by my side. I looked up at her. You want me to stay? You love me? I slowly reached up and brushed another tear from her face. I told you I loved you once. You were wrapped up in a blanket in my apartment, sleeping comfortably, and I whispered it to you, because it was eating me up from inside. She looked back. Somehow, I knew that was when you first loved me. Maybe I don't remember you saying it exactly, but I remember feeling it when I got up from the couch. That was the real reason I climbed into your bed that night. She took my hand and held it to her cheek again. Yes, I knew that you loved me then, even if I couldn't process the words. You loved me so much that you kept negotiating with the COO, even when she wasn't there. You loved me because you took me to places that were amazing and not expensive at all. You loved me so much you were going to let me go, believing that was going to make me happy. She shook her head. Don't ever feel like you have to disappear like that. I don't want you gone. I want you here with me. Not 4 days, not even 6. Every day, because I love you, Victor. I sat up, leaned into her, and put my arms around her. I love you, Jennifer. And I don't want to go to Washington. I want to stay in New York. Maybe find some position that lets me stay here and be with you every night. For the first time since I had met Jennifer, there was no wait, and it was the best feeling in the world.